Today on Face the Nation, the anthrax scare. Are more people at risk? And what about the war in Afghanistan? We'll cover it all in another expanded edition. Public health officials are vaccinating workers should there be an outbreak of smallpox now. We'll get the latest on that from Anthony Fauci of the National Institutes of Health and Massachusetts Senator Ted Kennedy, who's pushing new bioterrorism legislation. Will American troops have to invade Afghanistan in force to find Osama bin Laden? The chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Joe Biden, and one of the committee's ranking Republicans, Chuck Hagel, will talk about that. We'll get the view from the Arab world from the Egyptian ambassador, Nabil Fahmy. We'll round out the broadcast with terrorism expert Brian Jenkins, investigative reporter Seymour Hersh, former National Security Advisor Sandy Berger, and Los Angeles Times Washington Bureau Chief Doyle McManus. Gloria Borger's here, and I'll have a final word on winning in Afghanistan. But we begin with the latest on anthrax on Face the Nation.
Face the Nation with Chief Washington Correspondent Bob Schieffer. And now from CBS News in Washington, Bob Schieffer.
Good morning again, and we begin this morning with Dr. Anthony Fauci, who is here in the studio with us, and Senator Ted Kennedy, who's back home in Massachusetts. Dr. Fauci is the head of the Infectious Diseases Institute at the National Institutes of Health. Dr. Fauci, another report this morning of anthrax being found, this time at the Veterans Hospital here in Washington. We're told it's found in the mailroom. 5 mail workers are being given antibiotics. Is it likely that any of the patients, and there are 200 and some odd patients there, likely that any of them could be exposed or infected?
Extremely unlikely. You still need to make sure the staff is aware to look for any unusual situations with regard to lesions that might crop up with regard to cutaneous anthrax, but it would be very, very unusual for that to happen. The VA facility, as many people are aware of, is a facility in Washington that receives mail from the Brentwood facility, which we're considering the primary facility from which contamination has occurred because the original letters that went to Senator Daschle passed through the Brentwood facility. So finding contamination to whatever degree, very minor or what have you, in the VA system is not totally surprising. That's the reason why the officials were heads up about looking for that. Now that they've identified it, they have a few of the mailroom people on antibiotics. But the broad hospital, the patients themselves, extraordinarily unlikely that there's any contamination there in the sense of their being exposed, but you still have a high state of vigilance for that.
Let me ask you about this woman in New Jersey who was shown up with anthrax. And then, of course, we have the woman in New York who died of anthrax. It appears that they had nothing to do with the post office, which raises the question, is there cross-contamination? In other words, could they have received a letter that was in one of the facilities where some of these anthrax letters were, and somehow it got from one letter to another, and that's what caused it?
That certainly is conceivable. I think the New Jersey case of cutaneous anthrax and the woman at the Manhattan hospital that was inhalation anthrax are two entirely different. Likely entirely different. One, we'd have no idea really what's going on. The woman in New Jersey, her company received mail from receives mail from the Hamilton facility that had also some contamination. The fact that she got cutaneous anthrax and that there was anthrax spores identified in the mail slot from which she received mail makes it likely, not definitive, but likely that there was just what you're referring to, that there was some degree of spores which got on a letter to which she had personal contact. The idea of cutaneous anthrax is one that is perfectly compatible with that. The woman in the Manhattan hospital has inhalation anthrax with really no way of tracking where that came from. So she still is an outlier case. And the question is it an outlier of an already existing pattern, namely some exposure to mail that hasn't been identified, or is she the sentinel case in a new and evolving pattern? If the latter were true, you would expect to see other similar cases without explanation. Thank goodness we've not seen that right now. The mystery still remains, but we haven't seen something that would suggest that she was exposed by a way that had nothing to do with mail that may be in another environmental situation.
Well, saying that, would we expect other cases to crop up soon?
Exactly. If in fact the thing you worry about, trace her steps, was she in a subway? I mean, one of the things we're concerned about is the release of anthrax in a situation where the aerosolized components could have a wider impact. So you look for where she had been, with whom she had come into contact, and see if there's any indication that there are other cases cropping up. As of now, none. That's the good news. The bad news is that we still have a mystery of how this happened.
And then let me go back to the woman in New Jersey.
Right.
If, in fact, she got it off a letter that
Right.
just happened to be in the post office where another anthrax letter was, then what does that tell us about how many people have been exposed here, or could possibly be exposed?
Sure. If obviously most of the letters, many of the letters that have gotten into that facility have been intercepted and now have gone to Ohio for decontamination and then back. But still, you have to be concerned that there might be some that came out, like it is possible that we've seen with this New Jersey person. The approach to that is, if you look at the number of pieces of mail that have been distributed since this, it's measured in the billions. And we have one case of this woman who possibly, and maybe likely, had contamination through a secondary contamination of a letter. That means that the odds of that happening are very, very low. From what we've been through over the past few weeks, even though it's very low, you have to stay real heads up. And that's the reason why the word is out. People who might have had mail through those facilities should look for any unusual lesions on their hand. Whether they should be treated with antibiotics, highly unlikely that we should do that because of the relative
Now let me
low
ask you
risk.
about this other thing, and that is this report this morning that we now have public health officials being vaccinated against smallpox in case there's an outbreak of smallpox.
Right.
How worried should we be? What is the likelihood of a smallpox outbreak?
Well, you can't put a quantitation on how worried you should be, but what you can say, if I might, in response to your question, we must be prepared for this. We must be prepared for the use of smallpox as a bioterrorism weapon. The CDC, what they're doing is classic, appropriate public health approach. You vaccinate what we call the first responders, the people that are going to have to go out into the field, do the examination, do the isolation, do the quarantine. You've got to get them vaccinated. So the CDC is appropriately doing that now, just in case there is a smallpox attack. At the same time is that we're building up very rapidly our stores of vaccine so that if it comes to the point where we'll have to widely vaccinate, we will be prepared to do that.
All right. Dr. Fauci, thank you so much.
Welcome.
And now to Hyannisport, Massachusetts, and Senator Edward Kennedy. Gloria?
Senator Kennedy, let's talk some more about these smallpox vaccines that Dr. Fauci has been talking about. The healthcare workers are getting vaccinated. What about the rest of us? Are we moving too slowly in producing smallpox vaccines?
Well, first of all, all Americans understand that we have a strategic petroleum reserve. And the reason we have that, in case we are going to have a national emergency, the prices of oil were going up through the roof, or we are being denied petroleum. I think we need a strategic pharmaceutical reserve. We ought to set precise times, dates, resources to make sure that we're going to be able to deal not only with the smallpox and anthrax, but for all the other likely bioterrorist threats. This is the kind of effort and energy that we've had at other times in our history. At the start of World War II, Franklin Roosevelt said, we can produce 50,000 planes in 1 year. Everybody said we couldn't do it. We did it. We need that kind of determination to make sure that every single American is going to be given the kind of protection that we can give. We have the best researchers in the world, and we ought to put them to the task to make sure that every American is going to be protected against every likely possible threat from bioterrorism.
Well, Senator, how do you get that done? Should the federal government get in the business, actually, of producing these vaccines, or should it go to private pharmaceutical companies?
This has to be a partnership. The fact is that most of the pharmaceutical companies don't make these kinds of vaccines or do a great deal of research in this area, because it isn't really a matter of national urgency, but it is at a time a bioterrorist potential attack. And therefore, it has to be a partnership. That can be worked out. We can take various steps to help the industry to move ahead. But the point is, we want to protect every American. The concern that, and we ought to do it in an appropriate public health way. That means that we have to follow where the science and where the research leads us. That's one of the reasons I'd be very hopeful that Dr. Satcher would stay on. He is the leading public health doctor in our country as the Surgeon General. He's going to leave evidently in January. I would hope that the President Bush would invite him to stay, and I would hope that he'd be willing to stay on. We need the best in public health, the best in terms of research, but most of all, we need to set precise times. We have to have the resources available, and we ought to do the research not only in anthrax, smallpox, but the plague, but in the other possible areas of bioterrorism.
Well, Senator, do you have anything or know anything to suggest that perhaps Dr. Setcher, who is the Surgeon General, we should point out, is being pushed out?
No. His time is up at after January, and there's every indication that he would go to retire. I don't think we need on-the-job learning at this particular time. He knows the public health challenge, and this is a public health challenge, the danger of bioterrorism, because one of the keys, as Dr. Fauci has pointed out, is early detection, and that is the public health system. We have to develop early detection, so then we have the skilled personnel that will be able to detect the nature of the bioterrorism. They'll be trained, and then we'll have the vaccines to be able to treat it. So it's a combination of having the best in terms of public health. He is the public health doctor, and he is an outstanding one. I would hope that he'd be asked to stay.
Senator, one prominent scientist was quoted last week as saying that we should protect every single building's ventilation system with an armed guard. Are we really that vulnerable?
Well, that has to be evaluated by the nature of the particular kind of bioterrorist incident. There are a series of different challenges that we're facing in terms of bioterrorism, and some spread through the airs, others spread through food, others spread in different other ways in terms of communication, and we have to be able to develop the best kind of public health recommendations on the range of different kinds of likely threats.
Well,
we'll have to look at these in different kinds of ways, but we have to be reasonable and how we're going to be able to do this. But we have the best individual researchers and health personnel, and we can provide enormous protections for the American citizens, and we ought to be about doing it. That means investing in our public health system. It means working with the medical schools and the American Medical Society. Senator Frist and I are working closely together on follow-on legislation, and hopefully we'll be able to get that passed in the Senate before we recess.
Senator, let me follow up quickly on something you just said. You mentioned the food supply. Are you worried about the food supply becoming contaminated? Well,
first of all, we are only inspecting about 1% of the food that enters the United States. The amount of food that's entering the United States has escalated dramatically over the period of recent years. Historically, we were concerned about the pesticides, herbicides, and insecticides that were being used on the food prior to coming into the United States, and that presented some public health challenges. But now we know that there's a potential by bioterrorists, if they want to contaminate the food, that may be a way for them to do it. And that is why it is extremely important that we are going to have the adequate kinds of inspection and the work being done in order to protect the food supply. Secondly, as the Journal of American Medical Society has pointed out, we know that if cattle and poultry also take antibiotics, then we can build up in order to help them grow and develop, that there's now increasing evidence that can pass on the antibiotics into human beings, and therefore the new antibiotics which they use, if they have anthrax, might not be as effective. And so this presents some public health questions as well. We need to have the hearings, but we need to have policy, but the warning signals have been raised, and this should have our full focus and attention as well. The Secretary Thompson has identified this and spoken about it and has made some important recommendations.
All right, Senator Kennedy, thank you so much. We're going to be back in a minute with two key senators on the Foreign Relations Committee to talk about how the war is going in Afghanistan. In a minute. We turn now to the war overseas, and joining us from Wilmington, Delaware, Senator Joe Biden, the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Here in the studio, one of the ranking Republicans on that committee, Chuck Hagel. Let me put it to you, gentlemen, because I think this is the question that's going to be talked about and debated over the next coming weeks. Is the United States, Senator Hagel, going to have to put a large force of ground troops into Afghanistan to track down these people and bring them to justice?
Well, I think all the options must be on the table here, Bob. We certainly learned that over the last few years, most recent experience in the Balkans. What we always must remember is that the tools that the president has to conduct war must never be sacrificed to any early options in or out. All those options should be there. And if we early on take any of those options off the table, then we hurt our cause. So
would you support that if it became necessary?
Well, it depends on what we're talking about here. I don't think there's any question in the minds of most of us that we're going to use ground forces. We're going to have to use ground forces if we're serious about accomplishing the objectives that the president has laid out. I think they're going to have to be targeted and focused and probably special operations types of ground force activities. I don't see where you're going to put 500,000 men on the ground like we did in Vietnam or any of the large-scale efforts. But I think we have to be careful of one thing here, that we should allow the president and those charged with the responsibility of conducting this war to let these options play out, consult with the Congress as they do, as they are doing, and then let this play out a little bit. I think, run a risk here if we criticize and are too critical too early in the strategies and the tactics that the president is using.
All right, Senator Biden, what about it? Would you support it if a large force of American ground troops had to be put in there?
I support whatever the Pentagon says we need to win this war. The only thing I know for certain is we cannot lose. But to make Chuck's point, I think it's much too premature to make the judgment of whether or not the initial strategy and tactics used by the administration are a failure. That's what you're reading a lot about and hearing a lot about these days. I don't know. I believe the administration would like two things to happen. One, to not use a significant amount of ground forces and to win this earlier rather than later. But it may very well be that as things move on, they have to insert or at least contemplate larger infusion of ground forces. But again, I really think, Bob, it's much too early. I think back to the Kosovo war and the bombing, and the second day of the bombing, everyone declared it a failure. And we persisted, and it worked. Now, again, Chuck is much more experienced as a war hero and as a participant in a ground war to know whether or not that need exists. I just don't know. But so far, I think it's premature to make a judgment.
All right.
Senator Hagel, do you have any problem with the way the government has handled these terrorist alerts? We've had two of them so far, some of them sending contradictory messages, as we saw this week when Governor Gray Davis of California said that there was a problem with the bridges there, and the government said that wasn't a credible threat. How do you think they're handling this?
I think overall they're handling it just about right. These are tough calls. These are line calls. These are subjective calls. I think we're probably better off to allow the judgment of our Attorney General and FBI Director in these kinds of situations, where if they feel that in fact the best interest of our country is served by alerting the American public to some general threat, okay. But again, they recognize, as we all do, if you lay that out too many times, if you roll that out too many times and nothing happens, then of course you know the old wolf story. But right now I think the government is handling something that is unprecedented in the history of this country in a way that's just right. Last thing I would point out here, we're making this up as we go, Gloria. There's no roadmap, no blueprint here as to how to handle something like this.
Well, Senator Biden, speaking as of kind of making it up as we go along, and I think everybody kind of agrees that because we haven't faced anything quite like this. But one of the things, an underlining worry in all of this is in Pakistan itself, where people are worried about nuclear weapons. How worried should we be about the Taliban or somebody else getting a hold of the weapons that Pakistan has right now?
I am not too worried about that for two reasons. Musharraf seems to have control knows he has our availability to help if in fact he needs to maintain control. The ability to get the kind of weapons that they have available to them, that is the Pakistani government, and use them is very difficult. But should we be aware of it? Yes, we should be aware of it, and we should be prepared to help the Pakistanis. But in my discussions with the intelligence community and with the State Department, there is a high degree of confidence that Musharraf is in full control and able to maintain control of the nuclear arsenal possessed by Pakistan.
Senator Hagel, are you worried about our intelligence on the ground in Afghanistan? Say we do send an infusion of ground troops. Do you worry we'd be sending them into traps?
Well, that's always a risk that you face anytime you are applying ground troops in war. Now, with that said, I don't think you ever have enough intelligence. One of the criticisms, and I think it's been valid over the last few years, especially in the last couple of months, is that our human intelligence network has essentially eroded and maybe in some cases evaporated over the years, and that's a debate probably for another day as to why. But the fact is we don't have enough good human intelligence on the ground in Afghanistan. Intelligence in this kind of war is critical, like any war, but this kind of war, when they're all over the place, you need good intelligence.
Gentlemen, thank you very much. When we come back, I'll round out this half hour with our weekly commentary. When people asked last week, are we winning this war, I thought back to Vietnam when people asked that a lot. What it took us a while to understand back then was that when we have to ask, we are not winning. Winning is apparent. We'll know we're winning when Osama bin Laden is dead or behind bars and those people in the caves come out with their hands up, and when we can open a letter without wondering if it's going to kill us. No, we're not winning, not yet anyway, nor is this some adult version of Are We There Yet? And the government shouldn't try to treat it that way by pacifying us with soothing syrup. We don't need to keep hearing that everybody in the government has done everything right. What we need to know is that people are doing the best they can and those who weren't have been moved out. And that whatever the cost, we'll hang in there until things go our way. And they will. This country is just too big, too strong, too resourceful, and has always shown too much resolve for it to come out otherwise. They say the president's pondering what to tell the country this week. How about a little of that? And then a realistic assessment of just how hard this is going to be. Remind us, too, that this isn't Vietnam or about trying to help someone else. It is about an attack on us that left thousands of our people dead. If we keep that one fact foremost in mind, we'll eventually find a way to get this done. Back in a moment. And welcome back now to page 2 of Face the Nation. Joining us now, the Egyptian ambassador to the United States, Nabil Fahmy. Mr. Fahmy, Mr. Ambassador, welcome to Face the Nation.
Thank you.
Yesterday, Osama bin Laden put out another of his propaganda tapes, and he said everybody that belongs to the United Nations, Arab, Muslim, Christian, whatever, all of them are infidels. Egypt is a member of the United Nations. What's your response to Osama bin Laden?
I draw a very interesting conclusion from what he said, frankly. This is a campaign that the international community as a whole has to take on. Terrorism is a threat against all of us. And in many respects, the UN is the forum where we all gather. So this is another confirmation. He feels that the threat is coming, that the response is coming from the international community. And that's why he's nervous and angry. And I think we should continue to do what needs to be done to deal with Osama bin Laden.
He is taking this, he's trying to turn this into a war on Islam, is he not?
He's been trying to take advantage of Islam, distort Islam, to take on moderate regimes in the Middle East, take on civilized society in the West and in different parts of the world. But it's a distortion. I don't agree with the argument. Islam has nothing to do with what he's propagating. But international community as a whole has to work together. We've been facing this for 10 years before, and we solved it domestically, but it remained around us, whether in Europe, in Asia, or wherever. We cannot do it alone. We have to work together to solve this once and for all.
Mr. Ambassador, the Bush administration has made it very clear that it does not intend to stop the bombing during Ramadan. Do you believe that's a good idea or a mistake?
Well, to deal with terrorism, you will have to deal with security issues, political issues, social and economic issues, and juridic issues, legal issues. It's not going to be a one-element campaign. In terms of dealing with the public in the Middle East will feel sensitive about bombings in Ramadan. That being said, one has to factor in and balance how much you gain, how much you lose by continuing the campaign, the military campaign during Ramadan, whether you should do it or not. It's a difficult call. If I had a choice, I would not, but I would have to look at all the facts and all the figures before making a determination.
So you're saying from the American point of view, it may not be a mistake? You would not, but if you were President Bush?
What I said is that if I had a choice, but if I had all the facts before me, if I knew exactly what had been done in the campaign, how far we've achieved in the intelligence corporation, for example, and other things, one would make a determination. I'm not even sure anybody is ready to say, without looking at all the facts, that it is right to do it or right not to do it. So it's a very difficult call, and I think we have to be sensitive to the public. But the threat is there, and we have to continue this campaign.
Mr. Ambassador, how do you characterize feelings in the Middle East right now, in states like Egypt, toward this war? Does the man on the street in Egypt think that this has been an attack on the United States, that it's a terrorist attack, or do they buy what bin Laden is saying, that this is an attack on a religion?
No, not at all. They use the same argument with us. And we are basically, the majority is a Muslim country. So they use the same argument with us, that we were infidels, that we were not Muslims, we were not true believers. That's nonsense. People in the street are totally against terrorism. Where you see occasionally criticism of the U.S., it does not relate to the campaign against terrorism. It is a function of other policies which can be debated legitimately, but not with bin Laden.
What if the United States does have to put a large force of ground troops into Afghanistan? Will Egypt support that?
We have supported what the U.S. has done so far, which includes a military campaign against Afghanistan, because we know the threat of terrorism. This will have to continue, but it will have to be coupled with other measures. The decision on whether to go with ground forces, special forces, or bombing is a military one for the military advisors to decide.
Mr. Ambassador, what if this war were to broaden and widen, say, to Iraq? Would you still be with us?
The issue is we're pursuing terrorism. We're not pursuing other issues. As long as we're pursuing terrorism, we will be out there straight in the front. We were there before you on terrorism. Let's not pile up agendas. Let's keep the focus on what the issue is.
Well, that doesn't answer, though. If we were to believe that we would take the war on terrorism to Iraq.
Well, the point is how best to deal with the problem. You have the terrorists who came to the U.S. were living in Europe. Was the solution to that bombing Europe? How do you deal with this? You deal with the problem in the way it's brought forward to you. Bombing is not the solution to all of the aspects of dealing with terrorism. You would have had to bomb Germany, bomb Great Britain, and I would not recommend that. But you definitely have to work with them in making sure that civil society in these countries is not taken advantage of by terrorists. And that was our call 10 years ago.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much for articulating that view today.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
We're going to continue our expanded coverage on Face the Nation after this short break. And as we continue to go at this story from every conceivable angle, in Los Angeles this morning, terrorism expert Brian Jenkins. Mr. Jenkins, thank you for coming. Here in the studio, Seymour Hersh of The New Yorker. So I want to start with you, because this morning, Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld said, and this is not a direct quote, but the thrust of what he said is that the Taliban has ceased to function as a government in Afghanistan. Now, you have just written a piece in The New Yorker, which suggests that the first foray that we made in there with ground troops was almost a disaster, as you put it. Do you believe, and from what you're talking to, the people you're talking to, that the Taliban is no longer functioning as a government in Afghanistan?
maybe not as a government, but certainly as a military force they exist. And the article you're talking about simply made the point that our secret attempt to go invade the home of Mullah Omar, the head of the Taliban government, was a near disaster, as you say. We came in hot and heavy with an awful lot of special forces, did it by the book, I guess, with instead of going in, the Delta Force is our secret unit, the most secret unit in the government, and they're very competent, they know how to hurt people, and they like to operate by themselves in small teams. Instead, the way we did it was, you know, General Motors style. Hundreds of people, 16 helicopters, shoot them up. And when they got into the building where they hoped to either find the mullah or some of his documents, there was nothing there. When they came out, they got hit very heavily, a big counterattack, and it was a mess. 12 serious injuries, 3 very serious. And all of this was kept from the American people. There was a great deal of anger among the Delta Force. I write about that. They're not sure they want to operate this way.
Mr. Hirsch, this morning, though, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Chairman Myers, said that this, from his point of view, this mission, quote, went flawlessly. There was a total denial of your report, and particularly when you had written that they were not properly prepared, he said nothing could be further from the truth. So how do you respond to that?
Well, we just have to ask, you know, we have to wait and see what happens. You know, I've been there, done it. You and I, Bob, go back to the Vietnam War. Oh my God, here we are, B-52s again. And they didn't work then. I'm not sure that the facts are that, as I described them, it was a mess. It was even more than that. I described we all watched on television as we saw our Rangers parachute on, you know, remember the footage of that? And I write too that a lot of people were upset about that because before the Rangers went in, we sent a special Pathfinder team, a little scout unit, into the airfield that they were attacking, and the military command was told there was no soldiers there, no Taliban there.
Well, I think people who are not reporters always wonder, where does this kind of information come from? My suspicion is that this came from people, the people that talked to you were kind of upset about how this had gone, and they wanted people to know about that. I'm not asking you to disclose sources, but what makes you think this is true? I mean, you wouldn't have written it if you had not thought it to be a correct account.
And also, as people know in the business, the New Yorker has this incredible checking apparatus where the people I talk to are actually independently talked to by the New Yorker staff to make sure we have no serious factual errors. Sure, Delta Force is mad. Delta Force is so mad that they think the language is that this time we lost 12. Next time, if they do it again the same way, we're going to lose dozens. We can't operate that way. We operate by ourselves independently, not that messy.
We didn't lose 12 people. I'm sure you didn't mean to say that. 12 people were injured. Now, General Myers, and who was General Franks, the head of the command over there, says when you report 12 people were wounded, he said, well, it depends on what you count as a wound. Do you mean those were people that were shot, or do you mean they were hurt? Or?
Most of them had shrapnel injuries. 9 were not that serious. 3 were very seriously injured. Most had shrapnel. Most just got, there was a lot, the Taliban fired a lot of grenades at us in the counterattack.
Well, they say none of them were injured in return fire from the Taliban.
Okay. Well, we've had that before.
Okay. All right, let's shift a little bit and talk a little bit about terrorism. Brian Jenkins, you've been following and studying terrorism for a long, long time. Out there on the West Coast this week, Governor Davis comes out and said that the bridges out there, the Golden Gate, the Bay Bridge, some of the others were targets of terrorist attacks. He said he had gotten this information from law enforcement officials, and then they said, well, it wasn't quite that specific. I take it the bridges are still out there, but what's going on here with all of these threats and alerts that we're getting, and how seriously do you as a terrorism expert take these things?
Well, as of this morning, the bridges are still standing and they're still busy. But the issue is, as you point out, how we deal with these threats. We certainly, in the wake of September 11th, are hearing a lot more about threats that probably we wouldn't have heard about before. People have to understand that there's a high volume of noise in terrorism, threats, reports from intelligence sources, warnings, and a lot of these, most of these, in fact almost all of these, turn out to be just that, a lot of noise. But a decision has been made in a number of cases since September 11th that in fact we're going to share some of this noise with the public. Is that the right thing to do or not? I mean, when people think they have a credible threat, I think the public would demand that that be communicated to them. The government is going to become more adept as time goes on in communicating this threat information, but the more important thing is that we as citizens are going to have to become more adept in dealing with it.
Mr. Jenkins, as a terrorism expert, let me just ask you bluntly, how hard is it to take out a bridge?
It is extremely difficult. If we're talking about actually dropping the bridge and some of the more lurid speculation of scenarios of that type, it is extremely difficult. Can one set off a bomb on a bridge? Of course one can. But to actually topple a bridge takes a great deal of effort. Not easily done.
Mr. Jenkins, let me ask you about a report that was done by a Houston law firm, which has a Washington office, Bracewell and Patterson. They have a lot of energy clients, and they've done a study on the threat to our energy infrastructure. Let me just read you a couple of things here. They say, since September 11th, there have been credible threats to the Trans-Alaska Pipeline and the nuclear power plant at 3 Mile Island. They say there is no overall federal security requirement for the Trans-Alaska Pipeline or any other pipeline. They say a well-designed terrorist attack hitting several energy facilities at once has the potential of causing entire regional power grids to fail. That sounds like pretty serious business to me.
It clearly is serious. In fact, this was a topic of recent hearings at a Senate hearing at which Senator Biden presided, where we were looking at the security of critical infrastructure in this country. The problem we have is if we are going to catalog all of the vulnerabilities in our society, we're going to end up with 50 volumes before we get off of the East Coast. A lot of things in our society are very, very vulnerable to sophisticated and determined terrorist attacks. Clearly, security is going to have to be increased around these most critical components of our infrastructure. That is something that we have to do now. We probably are not realistically going to be able to deal with every single vulnerability. They are infinite.
Well, Cy Hirsch, where does that leave us?
Well, we have to simply prepare for a long war, and we have to go to the root. The root of the evil seems to me to be we've got to figure out some way to stop fundamentalism. We've got to make conditions for the average person in the Arab world better. Too many suffer, too many go to these kind of extreme actions because they have no chance. There's no life for many of them. In Egypt, in Saudi Arabia, in Kuwait, the money doesn't flow down. There's no trickle down.
Mr. Hirsch, doesn't this all come down really to a matter of our human intelligence on the ground in Afghanistan, as well as even here at home? Do we have a real intelligence gathering problem in this country?
No, we have terrible problems. You know, we have an FBI that needs to be retrained in how to do terrorism. We have a CIA that's been diminished in terms of its ability to collect human intelligence. Right now, everybody talks about no Pashto speakers. We're using Israelis. We've recently recruited some Israelis to work to help us translate documents in Pashto, the native tongue of the Taliban. So we have a big, huge problem. We will solve it. As somebody said to me in the article I just wrote, it's like you read a 600-page mystery. The last 2 pages tell you the end, but you have to read 598 pages to get there. We're on page 15. We'll get there. It's just going to take a long time.
Brian Jenkins, a final thought from you. What do we need to do to improve our intelligence gathering? Are we as in bad a shape as Cy Hirsch says we are?
Well, intelligence is never adequate unless you're absolutely confident that you'll be able to identify every terrorist cell in the world and predict and thwart every conceivable threat. So it's never going to be adequate. It's always a challenge. But the fact is, September 11th has awakened us to the fact that it is an extremely dangerous world. For a decade, we have pretended to believe that it is not, that with the end of the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union, that all we needed to do was basically commit ourselves to accumulating wealth and spreading prosperity, ignoring the fact that there are real threats out there. This has awakened us.
All right. I want to thank both of you to get your perspective on all of this. We're going to continue our expanded coverage, and we'll talk to Sandy Berger, who was President Clinton's national security advisor, in a minute. As we continue now, our roundtable with Sandy Berger, who is the former National Security Advisor to President Clinton, Doyle McManus, our old friend from the Los Angeles Times. Mr. Berger, let me ask you first about what happened in Israel this morning. We had a Palestinian gunman, another of these incidents, open fire on a busload of Israeli citizens. We know of some deaths, many injuries. And now the Israeli government is saying it may review its decision made earlier to pull back from one of the West Bank towns where it had Israeli troops. How serious is this, and what needs to happen here?
Another outrageous act of terrorism against innocent people riding a bus. I think the situation is very dangerous and very precarious. I don't believe that the two sides here can break this death grip by themselves, Bob. I think the international community, led by the United States, is going to have to exercise all the moral authority that we have to press them to implement the steps that they have agreed to achieve a de-escalation.
Well, you've been there, and you know how difficult this is. You can't just say, please don't do it. I mean, please, let's get together. What are the steps that need to be taken here? How do you get this
Well, they have agreed to the steps that have to be taken step by step. What we need now is 7 days of accountability or 2 weeks of accountability in which the international community is there with a spotlight and a stopwatch, putting the pressure on both sides to do what they've said they would do. In the absence of breaking this cycle, we're facing a very, very dangerous descent in the Middle East, which is going to complicate not only disasters for the Middle East, but complicate the larger situation we face.
Speaking of the larger situation, Doyle, you heard the ambassador here talk about bombing during Ramadan. Do you think that will make any difference in terms of our already tenuous coalition?
I think it will, Gloria. What the ambassador was talking about was, in a sense, the front we're paying not enough attention to, which is the war for opinion within the Muslim world. And that really requires the United States to do what it can on Israel. On Ramadan, what I am hearing from the White House is that while they've been saying this week there's not going to be a bombing halt through the whole month, they are sending signals that there will be pauses at the most sacred times of Ramadan. The first night, the last night, and the 27th night of Ramadan. These are the important holidays that month. They do want to send a gesture of sensitivity to the Muslim world.
For domestic political consumption, particularly among conservative Republicans who are calling for absolutely no halt, isn't that going to cause them a domestic political problem?
Well, the point
here?
they're going to make is this isn't a bombing pause for the whole war, and the war can survive a couple of nights of rest.
Sandy Berger, you have been involved in the past in dealing with terrorism. You've seen these terrorism alerts we've been going through, two so far in this country. Can you tell us a little bit about how the White House decides to go with something or not to go with something?
Well, there's an enormous amount of threat information, some of it more credible than others. You act on everything. The question is, what do you warn? I think we're in a situation now where the American people are on the heightened state of alert. We look around every room we walk in. We look at every parcel. So my own view is that we ought now, unless we have specific information that can actually help people make decisions, we ought to say to the American people, listen, we're living in a more dangerous world. We're going to be attacked by terrorism again. We're doing everything we can on the security side, and here's what we're doing. We're doing everything we can to fight terrorism. If we learn anything that is actually going to help you make a decision about what to do, where to go, we'll tell you. Otherwise, you are on alert.
So no more. Enough general alert.
I think it's a tough call because no one wants to be sitting on a piece of intelligence the day after something terrible happens. But we are already, as a people, on a heightened state of alert. We're almost at a hyper-heightened state of alert. And I think, again, it goes to the utility of the information. But these are very, very tough calls. And they have to be made ultimately on a case-by-case basis.
What does it mean when they say we have intercepts?
It means we've heard a conversation. But let me just tell you another part of this, Bob. Again, if we have something specific that can help people, that's fine. But in a sense, we empower people. This is now telephone terrorism, in a sense, that we've empowered. All of bin Laden's operatives have to do now is have a chit-chat on the phone, and that suddenly begins a kind of a shockwave through the system. So we have to, I think, continually recalibrate. I think the administration is doing that every day. Clearly, the American people need to know what generally what is useful to them, but I'm not sure the kind of continuing the next 24 hours something's going to happen is terribly helpful.
Doyle, what do you think is going to happen? What is the president going to talk about? What does he think he needs to talk to the American people about this week?
Well, clearly what has happened over the last week, Bob, is that the message has slipped away a little bit from the White House. As the story shifted from the war, an issue on which the president was quite effective during the first 3 weeks, to anthrax, an issue on which White House officials, not openly but privately to us, said we really don't want to put the president in the position of answering questions that we don't have the answer to. You want to keep a president away from bad news. That's just good politics. Well, the focus has shifted away. We have not had the sense of presidential leadership. And indeed, in the Middle East, there's been the sense that Osama bin Laden somehow has a better propaganda apparatus than we do. I think that's a transitory thing. He is going to go back to the basics. He is going to go back to the basics of why this war started, why we're in it. He's going to try and preach patience again, the fact that we're only 4 weeks into the war, and that doesn't mean we're in a quagmire yet.
You know, that raises an interesting question just from the standpoint of public relations and the president's credibility. It seems to me that the credibility that Franklin Roosevelt had was that he told the American people what the bad news was. And then when he had some good news to announce, I think that helped them to believe it. I mean, after all, it was President Roosevelt who announced what had happened at Pearl Harbor. He didn't have a lower level official do that. And I wonder, Sandy, is this president going to have to start telling people the bad news as well as the good news?
Yeah, we're in the early stages of this, Bob, and I think that the question is whether a democracy can fight a shadowy war under continuing public scrutiny. And I do think in this next phase, the president needs to help bring the American people, in a sense, up the learning curve. There's a tremendous desire for context, I think, among the American people. And listen, this is a terribly complex problem the administration is managing. I think they're doing a good job managing it. It's a multi-front war, but I think bringing the American people along so they understand the complexity of this, not sugarcoating it, but helping them understand this, I think, is an important part of leadership at this point.
Well, the next step of bringing the American people along may be making the case for ground troops. Doyle, has the president done that, or is that what he is also going to have to do in this next week?
He hasn't done that yet, Gloria, and it seems the signals we're getting from the White House is he has no inclination to do that in this coming week, simply because he and his advisors in the Pentagon think it is, as I think Senator Hagel said, way premature to get into that. I don't think we're going to hear a lot about ground troops from the president. To me, the fascinating thing is only 4 weeks into this war, we've got a very lively debate in the Senate on it. The question is on the table: are we willing to put substantial troops on the ground to fight this war?
Well, I mean, I think what's going on is the Senate, that most senators say, if you need to do it, we're ready to go along with you. And that's one reason I wonder why the president doesn't say, look, I may have to do this down the line, because he's got a lot of people on record right now that's saying they'd be willing to support him.
Well, I think there would be support, and clearly we're going to have to use ground forces. But let's step back a second here, Bob. We're 5 or 6 weeks into this. There's no problem-free strategy here. In the last week, we've had the administration has been criticized for bombing too early, not letting the Taliban ferment, I guess is a better word, bombing not early enough, not putting in enough ground troops, preparing us for a quagmire. There's no problem-free strategy here. We're in the early stages, and I think it's a little too early to start second-guessing.
Sound like you're speaking like a former national security advisor who's been there.
It's a lot easier when you don't have to make decisions.
All right. I would say that one thing, I think, speaking of spin, where there's been one mistake made, perhaps it was made by Osama bin Laden. He seems to have isolated himself by accusing all the other Arabs who are in the United Nations of being infidels. It seems to me he'd be trying to bring them together. I'm not one to give him any advice, but I think he may have messed up on that one. Gentlemen, thank you very much. That's our broadcast for today. Thanks for watching Face the Nation. We'll see you next week.